I currently work for Popper Lock. Our services include roadside assistance and we specialize in opening locked car doors. The job is cool. For the most part one helps some old lady open her car door. Occasionally, I get the drama queen, airhead types who seem to get themselves in a situation where they lock the keys in the car in the barroom parking lot. One night I was on call and the dispatcher sent me an address in a very shady area of the city. This call was in on 1st and Willow Street, a completely fucked up neighborhood. I decided to make an executive decision and drive as slowly as possible to the location. The drive should have taken about 15 minutes. I made it to the area in 45 minutes. Parking on the outskirts of the neighborhood, I contacted my dispatcher and asked if the person still needed services. As you can guess, they had been waiting all that time. Driving into this area was like driving into a scene of a movie. There were drug addicts on the street and dealers on the corner. Then there was me with my white ass driving through one of the roughest areas of the city in a white and orange van with yellow flashing lights. I felt like, no, I knew something was going to go down that evening. Arriving at the home, I called from my cell to ask if the person would come out. A woman answered the phone and said she would be out soon but would be safer if I came into the house until she was ready. Nope. Not happening, I said to myself. As I hung up the phone I heard a tapping on my passenger side window. The sound was that of metal on glass. I knew what it was, before I looked in the direction. Open the door please. I was scared, I will not lie to you. This dude looked fucking crazy. He had those long skinny dreads and the gun. The gun was freaking huge. When I opened the door he got in, putting the gun to my head and softly said, "Listen. You can live or die. I personally don't give a fuck. However, it would behoove you to hand me your wallet, cell phone, and get the fuck out the car." My mind was racing with what to do. Part of me was confused that he sounded so intelligent, and the other part of me was terrified by his enormous handgun. I felt like my brain was breaking inside my head. Handing him everything he asked for, I got out the van. He slid behind the wheel, rolled the window down, and again politely said, "I appreciate your cooperation. There was no need for things to get any worse. Have a good night and be safe in this neighborhood. There are some bad people around here." I just stood there. What the fuck just happened to me? I was now standing on the sidewalk in this all-black neighborhood, and why was he so nice about it? Finally the client brings her ass out the house. She was an older black woman in her 60s, dressed like she was going to church. She said, "I told you to bring your silly ass in the house, now they done stole your car. At least you alive, baby." She let me in the house to use her phone and call the police. When they arrived and took the report, one officer laughed and said he was glad I was alright, then he suggested I get a new job. As a little boy, my brother and I would play in the woods near our property in Lumberton, Mississippi. We spent hours running through the high weeds and playing hide and seek. In those days, the 1960s, things were different. There were no helicopter parents who followed your every step. Our only two rules were to be in before dark and stay away from the swamp behind the church. My brother and I were habitual rule breakers, and this evening was no different. It was a Sunday and there was evening service at the church. So we figured what better time to sneak around and take a look in the swamps than when everyone was at church. We entered the tall reeds behind the church, moving quickly and never letting our feet stay in the same spot for long. There were water moccasins everywhere. For those of you who are not familiar, a moccasin is a poisonous snake found in Louisiana and Mississippi. The reeds in the swamp were over 6 feet tall, so essentially my brother and I were not visible to anyone outside the area. As we hopped around in the reeds, my brother kept hearing movement coming towards us. Initially he said it was a deer. There were tales of a huge moccasin snake being in that swamp, but we figured it was just old wives' tales to keep kids out of the area. He gestured for me to be silent. The reeds swayed as if something was moving through them. It was moving quickly towards us. Imagine this, The 6-foot reeds of the swamp were spreading open, making a straight path for us. My brother grabbed my hand saying we got to go now. Moving as fast as we could, not running but leaping to keep our feet from getting stuck in the soft mud. It felt like it took forever to get out of there. I could hear the church choir singing as we exited the swamplands and ran up to the back door of the church. Leaning our back against the door, we looked back into the swamp and something was moving horizontal to us along the reeds just at the edge of the swamp. Till this day I believe it was a snake. However, that it would have had to have been at least 4 feet tall to make the reeds lay down that way. When we told our parents, my dad said we should have been our asses in church and the devil ran us out the swamps. My family home is very close to a cemetery, and no, this is not a story about a ghost. We see them all the time here in New Orleans. As a kid, my friends and I would play in the cemetery. Hide and go seek was the preferred game, especially after dark. This night we were playing and it was 7 of us. The cemetery took up an entire square block in our neighborhood. So the games would take some time for everyone to get caught, but eventually you would have 6 people looking for the last person. I hid high in a corner under a cement cross for 30 minutes as I listened to each person one by one get caught. The spot I had was well concealed and elevated so I could see the entire cemetery. From my vantage I noticed that there were 8 figures in the cemetery. My 6 friends looking for me and 2 other larger people who were in the far end of the cemetery standing together. I thought it was strange, but in my 12-year-old mind it was just some people visiting family. My friends were closer to me than them, and were all getting closer to me. After another 10 minutes of searching they all begin to call out my name, which was the sign for me to come out and take my rightful place as winner. As I climbed down I heard someone else call my name. It was a loud and deep voice of man. Looking up from my position I could see that all my friends had frozen in place and were looking around. The 2 figures that were at the other end of the cemetery were now running towards them. I screamed to them, "Run! Run! Someone's coming!" as I jumped down from my hiding spot. When my feet hit the ground I was moving. Byron, the oldest of us all, was the first person I saw. He was looking back towards the direction the men were coming from. When I passed him he started running too. Reaching the far end of the cemetery we jumped the fence and ran into the darkness of an open fields. One by one our friends came jumping the fence. Some ran home, others ran into towards the light of the playground a few blocks over. Byron and I stood in the darkness and watched the cemetery. After a few minutes a man appeared along the fence line. This dude was big. He just stood there looking around. He then screamed my name, "Chris. Where are you, Chris?" Byron whispered to me, "Bro, let's go." We tiptoed to the back of the field, jumping the fence and emerging on the next street. Telling our friends was pointless, they would have figured we were bullshitting them.
This happened to me when I was 13 years old. I was catching a flight from New Orleans to Kansas City to spend the holidays with my grandparents. My dad was nervous about me flying so far alone, however I was known as the responsible child in our family. We rushed to the airport. Upon arrival my dad escorted me to Southwest Terminal and gave me a huge hug. He looked worried, so I assured him I would be fine. As a minor I was allowed to pre-board the plane, so I got the pick of the best seats and wanted to sit on the wing of the plane. There were only 2 seats at the wing of the plane. I can still remember the excitement and freedom I felt as a young teenage girl taking my first flight. As passengers boarded I watched each person eyeball various seats. It was fun guessing which seat a person was about to take. As my eyes shifted I locked eyes with a huge black man. He looked like he played football in his younger days, but had grown overweight with time. He decided to sit behind me and took a window seat. Placing him to my rear left where there was open space between me and the exit door. He sat down and said, "Hello, young lady." Looking over my shoulder, I smiled and said hello. As more passengers boarded the plane, I caught eyes with another man. He was a tall middle-aged black man with gray hair. He wore black dress slacks and an olive green blazer. Something was off with him. His blazer was dirty with small holes in it. As he approached, I knew he was going to sit next to me. I could feel it. Other passengers rustled around placing their carry-on luggage in the overhead bins, but this man just stared at me. I started feeling nervous and looked away, praying that he would not sit next to me. Unfortunately, a few seconds later he plopped down next to me, not saying a word. Deciding to be a big girl, I looked at him and said hello, figuring if I spoke to him he would be nice. He just looked at me and did not say a word. The flight attendants were going through their fasten your seat belt speech when I started to really feel uncomfortable. There was plenty of leg space, but he was going out of his way to make sure our legs touched. As I shifted my body away from him, he mumbled something under his breath. Just go to sleep, I told myself, and this will all be over soon. The cabin lights went out as we taxied up the runway, turning everything dark. As we took off, the gentleman behind me asked if I wanted a stick of gum, a kind gesture that I politely declined. For a while I stared out the window and my thoughts drifted to my dad. I missed him already. He was a great man who always looked out for me. A feeling of peace and calm came over me thinking about him. He must be worried, I said to myself. The man next to me had settled in and to my relief was no longer touching me. So I settled in for a power nap. 30 minutes into my rest I was awakened by the sensation of someone touching my arm. The feeling of a wet hand on my right forearm made me cringe. Opening my eyes, I noticed the man now had his jacket off and on his lap and had his left hand under his jacket. I could see a bulge and back and forth movement beneath the jacket, but wasn't sure what he was doing. I said to him, "Why are you touching me?" "Nothing," he just stared upwards. As I jerked my arm away from him, he lifted the jacket revealing his penis while quickly pulling my right hand, forcing me to touch it. Oh my god. Pause. There are no words to explain how I felt. I had never seen a penis, now I was touching this fucking weirdo. Worst moment of my young life. He forced me to touch his privates for what seemed like forever before I was able to pull away from his grip. The man behind me must have noticed the commotion as I saw him grabbing the guy by the shirt collar, pulling him back and choking him. The ruckus got the attention of the flight attendant as they wrestled over the seat. I was able to spring up, sliding past the guy into the aisle and get to safety. By then the man who was sitting behind me had maneuvered his way out of his seat and into the aisle, where he was able to pull the jacket from the man's lap, revealing his genitalia. 2 other male passengers rushed over. One punched the man while the other 2 ripped him from his seat and slammed him in the aisle. I remember the pilot coming across the speaker demanding order on the plane as everyone was standing trying to see what happened. Ushered to the back of the plane, I was questioned by the flight attendants about what happened. I will never forget the look on their faces. It was a combination of anger and fear. The man was restrained using seatbelt extenders and placed at the back of the plane. When we landed in Little Rock, Arkansas, police boarded the plane and escorted me off. The man was taken off the plane in handcuffs. Several people missed their connecting flights to give statements to the police, and my father was called. I told him there was an incident on the plane with a crazy man. There was no need to make him feel helpless. When I finally arrived in Kansas City, I explained everything to him. A few days later he told me the man had a history of assaulting children and would be doing some time in jail. Even as an adult, when I travel now, I rarely sleep on a plane. Also, I'm extremely paranoid about people in my personal space.
I'm a construction engineer in Arkansas, working for a major utility company throughout the state. I have had my job for 38 years. During all 38 years I have been required to spend countless hours in the woodlands and marshes of Arkansas. I have encountered many strange things, from people living in the middle of nowhere, angry landowners, large unknown creatures, you name it, I've seen it. What I'm going to share with you is one of the times I was scared nearly to the point of quitting my job. My company was scheduled to build a power line from Corning, Arkansas to Greenway, Arkansas. The process of building a new line requires extensive field work to determine the best route. There are many factors that affect what is done, including the soil type, and property owners' rights. So I went out to scout the line path starting from Greenway working backwards to Conway. The process calls for going deep into the woods and sometimes into places that humans have never been. Down into deep hollows and over some steep terrain. I would always take my GPS along with a rifle. My company never knew about the rifle, but I figure what good am I if I'm dead? I arrived in Greenway late on a Tuesday night and lodged at a log cabin. There were no hotels in this small town, just hunting cabins. There were several other people in the cabins around the area, so I joined them for some coffee and conversation. We talked for about an hour before I was asked what I was there to do. Arrogantly I told them about what my job was and how important I was. This was long before I understood the etiquette of an outdoorsman. One of the guys said, "Sound like you're headed straight for Devil's Hollow?" They all laughed, as if it was some kind of inside joke. "What's Devil's Hollow?" I asked. "Well, it's a place nobody intentionally goes," said one of the men. "You should prolixly get a few of your buddies from work to head down there with you." "Why?" I asked. "Well, we don't talk about it much in these parts, but some bad things have been known to happen to people who trespass on the property there. So someone owns that property. I don't have any records of that owner's name. Listen. When you find yourself in the section of the woods that goes quiet, you're entering into Devil's Hollow. Just turn back and work around from the other side. Once you go down into that hollow, you will be in a world of trouble. Trust me on this one." I bid the men good night with a lot on my mind. Looking at my maps, there was no hollow anywhere on it. There was no steep drop-off anywhere I could see between Corning and Greenway. The next morning I went to the general store and got a few bottles of water, some chips, coffee, and energy bars and headed out to the train. I unloaded my four-wheeler and embarked along a small train into the woods. I rode the entire morning, stopping to take pictures and staking of places for us place transmission line poles. All was fine. I even spotted a few hunters in their blinds. They were not too excited about my four-wheeler making noise coming down the trail, but they waved anyway. At 3 p.m. I reached the edge of a pretty steep drop-off. I could not take the four-wheeler down and had to walk it. There was a small game trail that I found about 75 yards to the east of where I stopped. I decided to venture down it. Halfway down the slope I noticed the forest was silent. I could every footstep I made echo across the area. Figuring I would get to the bottom quick enough and survey the area, Devil's Hollow crossed my mind, but I figured a bear was in that area and ran the game out. Reaching the bottom, I took out my GPS and my map to make notes of elevation, thinking to myself, I need to make sure we didn't have a design that forced us to place a T-line pole in the base of this hollow. When I started hearing footfalls, they were everywhere above me, to the north, south, east, and west. There were rapid bipedal movements, not the sound of deer or other animals. These were the sounds of people moving in every direction. However, the brush was thick and I could not see anyone. My instincts were telling me to get out of there, so I started to ascend back up the hollow. The climb was steep, and I pulled myself up by grabbing trees and anything I could use as leverage. Moving through the tress and brush, I could no longer hear the sounds, but I had the feeling that I was being hunted. Looking over my shoulder, and I spotted two men coming up after me. Their clothes were in shambles. One had denim overalls on with a red t-shirt. The other had on blue jeans that looked like they had almost never been washed. There was caked dirt and mud on them. The man in the overalls was big. He was unusually large, his face was disfigured. What stood out most was the size of his ears. He was the killer. He had the look in his eyes. Thinking to myself, what have I stumbled on? These are some crazy, inbreed, backwoods fuckers. I decided to tell them something to see if they would stop. Hey. I work for the power company and I'm just checking out the area. They said nothing and keep coming up the hill. They were about 30 yards away from me when I noticed they both had huge hunting knives. Whoa. Whoa. What are you doing? I said. They kept coming. Now. I started climbing as fast as possible, thinking to myself I should have brought my rifle. They were keeping a steady pace and had a crazed look in their eyes. Reaching the top of the hollow, I heard a gunshot and froze. Checking myself, I just knew one of them had shot me. I patted my face, chest, legs, and arms looking for the blood. I not hit. Good. The eye slowly turned and looked behind me and they had stopped as well. Now on level ground I took off running to my four-wheeler. As I rode down the game trail for about 40 yards when a hunter in ghillie suit flagging me down. Slowing to a stop, I reached for my rifle. He said, "Is that any way to treat the man who saved your life?" My body started to ease of the tension and stress. Words came out of my mouth in a fearful voice. He touched my shoulder and said, "You're all right. Relax, they ain't coming up out that hollow, it's too many of us waiting to kill one of them bastards." I said, "What?" He went on to explain that a few hunters had ventured into that hollow over the years and never returned. Police had been in there and found nothing. Everyone knew there was a group of people living down there, some real backwoods psycho fuckers. He said at night you could hear screams from down in the hollow. There were women and children living there as well. He pulled a hand-drawn map from his pocket and proceeded to show the boundaries of what he called their territory. It showed a series of houses down in the hollow. He explained those crazy fucks had forced the rightful owner of the land to deed it to them and killed him in the 1950s. The term he used was that they had been inbreeding there ever since. I thanked him and told him the lodge I was staying at and offered him to have some coffee and talk more. He just smiled and said, "You don't remember me, do you?" I thought back and I did remember his face. He was there the night before when I had coffee and was warned about the area. He was sitting in the background smoking a pipe listening to conversation. I was overwhelmed. In an awkward gesture he patted me on my back and told me head on in. When I returned to the lodge it was quiet, but by nightfall people were talking about what happened to me. A few of the hunters found it funny. To me it was not a laughing matter. It was a frightening experience. I called the local sheriff and they came out and took a statement, but said there was nothing that could be done since no assault occurred. That next morning I called my head office and told my boss what happened. This fucker laughed at me. I was infuriated. He told me I had only 2 days to scout that area and I needed to get it done and hung up the phone. What a dickhead. The next day I drove into Conway and worked the wooded area moving back towards the hollow from the other side. I stopped 2 miles out from the hollow and just decided to estimate the distances. Later that year when the line was being constructed, we had to do a change order. The change cost an additional $5 million to the company because I had not scouted that 1 mile area. I was reprimanded by my boss, and when he asked why I had not scouted the area, I reminded him of the conversation we had. He was pissed and called me a coward. I simply told him I would be happy to have him accompany me down into that hollow to take a look to see if I was lying. This incident made me the butt of many office jokes. I would find random shit at my desk like branches and leaves. People genuinely thought I was a coward. Eventually, construction started and the transmission line spanned across the hollow. The construction crews complained about people watching them and returning to the site the next day to find equipment vandalized. During the project roundup meeting it came out that there were some crazy-ass people living in the woods in that area, and they had attacked one of the contractors working near the hollow. Then, I was asked to tell this story and people freak out. I never forgave my boss for the way he treated me, and eventually we ended up in a hairy situation in the woods together and I decided to leave his ass. I will tell you that story next time. But I will say this. He shit his pants. Arrogant no good fucker.
I work for an insurance company as a customer service representative. It's a rewarding job, but sometimes it can be stressful. 4 years ago I had an episode where the combination of stress from my job and the death of my mother sent me over the edge, and I was admitted to River Oaks Hospital psychiatric ward. After arriving in this place I quickly realized that I was good. The little stress and depression I was feeling should have been handled with some beer and wine. I was given a drug for schizophrenia. Yes, I was tripping, but nothing like these people in this place. The first night I was placed in a room by myself and listened terrified to the sound of people screaming and moaning all night long. The person across the hall from me was just banging on the door over and over again, until the orderly came stopping them. I heard weird scratching and squeaking sounds. The shit was fucked up. The next morning we were allowed to congregate to have breakfast, and that is when I really knew I had to get out of there. One man was just walking in circles talking about his love for Satan. There was a group of women sitting at a table playing some kind of invisible game. It looked like they were playing cards. The creepiest thing of all was one of the male nurses. He would just stare at me, as if he was waiting on me to do something. I would wake up at night and sometimes see him watching me through the door window from the hallway. This fucker gave me the creeps. On my final day there he approached me during lunch and congratulated me on making a quick recovery. Initially I felt better, until he said he would miss watching my breast and my hard nipples under my nightgown when I was asleep. I left that day and haven't allowed myself to ever get into a state of mind like that again.
I have been working for a crime scene cleanup company for 5 years now. I won't disclose the name because there are not many of these organizations in my state, nor will I disclose the area of the city. I'm not sure if I could get in trouble with the local police department, but I rather not take a chance. Our job included homicide, suicide, unattended deaths, and blood vehicle bioremediation. Essentially, we clean up after any kind of death or murder. The incident I'm going to share with you is from my first year on the job. We are assigned partners to help us clean crime scenes. Mark, a 25-year-old black man, was my first partner. Mark was such a cool person. He had an air of confidence and really nothing freaked him out. Being new to the job, his demeanor helped me tremendously, because I was prone to freak out. This particular job was to clean up the site of a homicide. 2 men had been killed execution style according to the local police department. When Mark and I arrived, the crime scene investigators were walking out the door. "It's a mess in there, so glad I don't have your job." Mark walked in first and looked around. When he came out he smiled and said these were some sick bastards. Entering the house I could smell the familiar scent of blood. If you have never been around fresh blood, it smells like old pennies. I'm not saying this to be funny. Over the years I have developed the ability to describe many smells from the crime scenes. Anyway, back to the story. In the living room there were 2 outlines showing where the bodies once laid. On the base of the wall opposite the outlines was splatter. Splatter is the word I came up with to describe the pretty much everything. In this case it was a mixture of brain matter, blood, skull fragments, facial tissue and teeth. What was strange about this was someone had taken their finger and drawn 2 symbols in the splatter on the wall. It was my first time seeing anything like this and I asked Marks what he thought. "I don't think anything," he said. "People are fucked up, man. Fucking savages." Marks started the process of moving the remaining furniture so we could tear out the carpet in the room and remove the padding beneath. For the record, it's not like in the movies where you spray a magic solution on the carpet and just scrub it up. Blood soaks through the surface and even stains the concrete below the floor covering. Anyway, as we started to cut the carpet along the edges of the wall, Mark paused. His eyes rolled back and forth like he was looking for something. I thought nothing of it at first. We proceeded to cut and roll the carpet, then cushion beneath. I dug the carpet out to the van as Mark started treating the concrete slab with a bio-cleaning solution. From outside I could see him looking around. It was strange because he was always so focused and we would normally get in and out on the cleanup in less than 2 hours. Walking back in, I started to ask him what was up. He gestured for me to be quiet and pointed to the ceiling. A faint sound could be heard like something moving. "It's just a mouse," I said. "Let's finish this up." Next we had to remove the drywall and baseboards with the splatter. I started cutting the section of the drywall and out the corner of my eye I saw Mark walking to the back of the house. In my mind I figured he was going to use the bathroom. He did have a habit of taking shits in the most random places. I just figured he would be adding this place to his list. Upon cutting half the wall out and tearing out the baseboards, I began to drag the debris out of the house. That is when I first noticed Mark had not returned. I shouted, "Mark! Stop fucking around!" Nothing. Hurrying back into the house fully expecting to see him on the toilet. Opening the bathroom door, I was surprised not to find him. Walking from room to room in the house, he was nowhere to be found. I walked out the back door of the house and he was standing in the yard looking up at the window to the attic. "Dude! What the fuck are you doing?" Mark looked terrified, his mouth open, staring upwards. I turned to see what he was looking at. Upstairs in the small attic window was a dim light and a silhouette moving back and forth. Just swaying back and forth, slowly moving. Mark started to walk back into the house with this determined look on his face. I already knew what he was going to do. He was going into the attic. "Mark? This is not a good idea, bro. Let's just call the police." Mark opened the attic door and proceeds to climb up. I asked, "What can you see?" He did not respond. Climbing the attic steps, what I saw was horrific. A man was hanging from the ceiling naked, his arms and legs were missing, and he had metal rods inserted where his limbs should have been. His body was suspended in the air from 2 metal rods where his arms once were. Beneath him was a pile of urine and feces. I vomited and began feeling dizzy. Mark pulled out his cell phone and began to dial. That's when the man begins speaking. "The gates of hell are open. We drink the blood of dead children, and consume their souls." This was way too much to handle. It was like something out of a fucking horror movie. I went back down the stairs and out the back door. Mark came down soon after on his cell phone telling the police they are not going to believe this shit. Officers arrived and questioned us like we were suspects until one of the homicide detectives that we knew arrived. We stuck around as the paramedics pulled the man out the attic. Billy, a paramedic, said this was the worst thing she had ever seen. What made the situation worst was Mark and I now had to clean the attic of this house. Years later, I drove by the property on my way to a Mardi Gras parade. There is a family living there now. That is some creepy shit. An entire family living in a house that was the site of a quadruple homicide, torture and God knows what else. They really should have used diedinhouse.com.
I have a great love for coffee, and it's this habit of drinking coffee that led to all my misery. How could something so simple lead to so much pain? During my freshman year in college, I would often study off campus at a small coffee shop. It was pretty nice for the area. I loved the mellow music they played and the free Wi-Fi. I had been told I was an attractive woman, but I suffered from low self-esteem. So naturally I hid my face under the brim of my favorite old Navy red hat. I developed a habit of wearing it whenever I study, regardless as to whether I was indoors or not. The walk from the dormitory to the coffee shop was a little over a mile and a half. I could make it there and back in 41 minutes. I know because one day I timed the walk to Janet Jackson songs. The young man, Eric, who worked the counter there, was cute. In a geeky athletic way. He was handsome but still seemed shy and reserved. The manager of the place was a lesbian. The fat Rosie O'Donnell type lesbian. This particular day I stayed at the coffee shop pretty late. The place closed at 10 p.m. and I was walking out as they locked the front door. Eric, must have finally gathered the courage to hit on me, so he asked if he could walk me back to my dorm. I figured why not, it was late and I had seen this guy every day for the past 4 months. He walked his bicycle alongside him as we traveled a mile back to my dormitory. Like most college campuses, there are a few dark areas around, but there was nothing to really fear. At least I felt that way until that night. As we walked along the main road, cars whizzed by making that familiar whooshing sound. When we made the left onto the campus, there is a section called Pecan Alley. The area is given its name because of the pecan trees that grow along both sides of the pathway. The area was dark because the trees had grown over the years to block out the lights. Eric paused as we started down the path. Looking back at him, he was much taller than me. He looked worried and scared. Up until this point he had been very talkative, even kinda sexy to me. I was considering taking him up to my room and wanted him to keep walking with me. He told me he had a bad feeling and we should not go this way. The look in his eyes was worrisome, but I walked this way every day. So I smiled and said, "Come on baby, let's go." As we passed under the trees, he was constantly looking around like he saw something I could not. Then I heard what sounded like footsteps coming fast up on us from the trees. Eric turned towards the sound and I watched his face as someone came out of the trees. Immediately he put his hands in the air. My eyes focused on a huge gun pointed at his head. I wanted to scream but couldn't, tried to run but my legs were stuck, my brain was not working, fucking nothing worked. "Turn around bitch," the guy said in a hillbilly tone. He hit Eric in the head with the gun. I remember the sound of his bike dropping and the sound of the air leaving his body as he fell forward, his stomach hitting the front wheel of the bike. He dropped so hard I told myself to run but my legs would not move. I was terrified. Now the gun was in my face. The barrel on the gun, it looked so big. He grabbed me by my hair and started pulling me forward. My body was hunched forward as I stumbled along and his gun was at the top of my skull. Thinking, why me? Why me? I looked back and through my hair I could see Eric's silhouette laying on the ground on top of the bike. My mind was drifting of trying to deal with the situation. Thinking stupid shit, Eric is okay, he just fell hard, he will get up and help me. I felt like I was outside of my body. I can't say how far he pulled me by my hair, but I do know when I snapped back to reality, the sounds of a door opening, I knew it was the door to a van as it was a sliding door sound like my uncle's old brown van he had when I was a little girl. Whoever this was going to rape me and kill me. I started to scream and pull away. Then I felt a sharp pain on the back of my neck and everything went dark. I woke up on my stomach to the pain of him thrusting himself inside me. Pinned down with his body weight on top me and his hand on my neck. I tried to push up, and really over. Then came the feeling of him ejaculating inside me. I can't explain that feeling, just can find the words to express the disgusting feeling that I felt. His weight started to lift off me and for the first time I realized I was not in the van. I'm somewhere else, pulling away from him while crawling forward on the floor. I turned around to see who he was. He was standing, his dick out, just standing there, this look of pride on his face. Like he had just won a prize. Looking around the room, the windows are all blacked out. Dust and dirt was everywhere and only a bed was in the room. There was blood on the sheets. Just then I felt it, the pain inside my body. I felt like I had been violated in every way. I looked down and realized I was nude and dirty. There was blood between my legs and the pain in my anus was awful. I looked up at him and screamed, "Why did you do this?" He was white with dusty reddish brown hair. His pubic hair were brown. He was not fat but almost, and had a chest tattoo that said "Mama's boy." The pain was so intense. I thought about charging him, grabbing his balls and try to bite them off. I even tried to move forward but the pain was so intense. He just stood there looking at me. I felt helpless. So helpless. My mind wondered what happened to Eric. Was he still alive? I was snapped out my daydream by the sound of the door to the room closing and the ominous sound of metal and what sounded like chains. Looking around the room for clothes, nothing. I'll wrap myself in the bloody sheets. What the fuck, I thought. Just then I felt his semen oozing out of me. I had to get the fuck out of here. The metal bed frame could be used as to break the windows. I flipped the mattress and took a small section of the metal bed frame and started banging into the window. They were not glass, some kinds of plastic, and only scratched it. I started beating on the walls. It chipped and cracked and I realized it was plaster, just beating and beating. The noise got his attention cause I heard the chain and the locks. Deciding it was better to die than to be raped over and over again. As the door opens I charged it with the bed frame section, jamming it through the door. I heard the grunt and then a whoosh, the sound of air leaving the body. Looking cautiously around the half-open door, he was still naked and had been hit him in the stomach. The fucker was bleeding. I started to kick him in the face. By the third time my foot began to bleed and I felt his teeth cutting my flesh, but I did not stop after a few minutes or sinking my foot into his face. He coughed and gurgled blood, passing out. Frantically searching the house for some shoes or clothes, but nothing, no keys, no nothing. I went back to him to check to make sure he was still down and he was fucked up. I decided to just leave with the sheet wrapped around me. Opening the door to the house, the place didn't look familiar, but it sounded familiar. I could hear the sound of the traffic from the main street across from the coffee shop. I was in the rural area not too far from the coffee shop. The first 20 minutes were a struggle. My right foot was bleeding badly and made it hard to walk. Each step was painful as the grass and dirt dug into my foot. Eventually I came to the access road that paralleled the highway and a car stopped to help. The woman said everyone was looking for me. She hurried me into the car and took me to the police station. I was given medical attention and asked to take them back to the house. When we arrived he was still bleeding and nude on the floor. I wanted to kill him. I should have killed him. Turns out that I had been missing 48 hours. Eric survived and went to campus police. He was able to give a description of the guy, and he was even pulled over in the van. However, the police let him go the same night he had abducted me. Since these events I have had a shitload of therapy, taken martial arts lessons and have license to carry a weapon. My husband Eric has been supportive of me. I now carry a snub-nose revolver with me and always trust my gut feeling. To those people who talk about gun control, try being raped by a degenerate redneck fucker, then talk to me about my guns.
Do you want more stories? We have more for your listening pleasure. Feel free to comment, and please subscribe to the channel to show your support.
Years ago I worked as a nurse in New Orleans charity hospital. Our hospital was known for two things: gunshot wound treatments and the third-floor mental facilities. The running joke was, if you're crazy or have been shot, go to charity ER. As an emergency room nurse I saw it all. From bullet wounds to the eye socket to violent schizophrenics who would kill you at the first opportunity. One winter night we got a rush of craziness. In room 1 we had a young lady who had been shot in the left breast. In room 2 was a 19-year-old black male who had AK-47 wounds to the shoulder and upper thigh. Poor kid had chunks of his flesh missing and bone exposed. As we struggled to stabilize the young man and stop his bleeding, his pressure dropped and he went into cardiac arrest twice. The second time his heart stopped beating for a full 60 seconds before he came back. After what seemed like many hours and 15 bags of blood, he was finally stabilized. I cleaned up and tended to the rest of the patients. Later, while making my rounds and checking his vitals, he opened his eyes and just stared at me with a strange look, almost like he knew me. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak due to the endotracheal tube we use multiple times on him. As I left the room, I felt like he wanted to tell me something, but I just brushed it off. An hour later, things had calmed down and were quiet in the ER. We were drinking coffee when the nurse button was pressed in his room. I sent one of my staff to go peek in on him, and they said all was well. 10 minutes later, the button was pressed again and I went to check in on him. This time I grabbed his chart at the door because I wanted to know his name. As I walked into the room, he looked at me intensely with a level of compassion in his eyes. He whispered softly, "Don't take the elevator." Confused, I looked at him. This young man looked at me as if I was his child and he was afraid for me. I said, "Sure, Mr. Taylor, I won't take any elevators." He closed his eyes, and that was the last I heard of him that night. I worked 12-hour shifts, so by 6 a.m. it was time for me to be heading home. As I headed out of the building, the sun was rising, but it was not fully up yet. I walked into the parking garage and stopped at the elevators, pressing the button. My car was parked on the 4th level. As I stood there alone waiting in the dark, I got a strange feeling and remember what Mr. Taylor said. Just then the elevator door opens and I decided not to step in. I quietly opened the door to the stairs and tiptoed up to the 4th floor. The whole while I was sneaking up the stairs, I felt so stupid. Really, you're listening to a man who almost bled to death. As I got to my car, I cranked it up and quickly worked my way down to the 3rd level, circling past the elevator door. When I got to the 2nd level, I could have shit my pants. There was a man standing there with all black on in front the elevator door. He turned and looked at me as my headlights shone on him. The look on his face was terrifying. He was waiting on that door to open. His eyes were just soulless, like he saw through me. I hit the gas and turned to go to the final level. When I reached the gate, I had to dig in my purse to find my access card. I dumped the crap out my purse onto my passenger seat and found the card. While speeding away, I called Zach, a NOPD police officer who was normally on duty at the hospital, and told him what happened. He promised to go take a look as he was in the area. The next evening at my 6 p.m. shift, I clocked in and went straight to Mr. Taylor's room. He had been moved from the ER to the 7th floor. When I walked in, he smiled. "You listened?" He went on to explain that when his heart stopped, he had an out-of-body experience. Time sped up and he saw me get on the elevator. He said he also saw the man waiting. He was pure evil, he said. The kind of person that police fear. He said I would have never been seen again. Part of me felt like it was bullshit, but then I remember those eyes. I called Zach to follow up about the person in the parking garage. He said the man I saw had escaped from the 3rd floor mental facility and was a psychopath convicted for the torture and rape of 6 women. He was at the hospital for an evaluation when he escaped. From that day on, when I worked the 6 p.m. shift, I parked on the street next to the ER entrance. That way I could always been seen by security. I was thankful to that young man and visited him often until he was released from the hospital.
Do you want more stories? We have more for your listening pleasure. Feel free to comment, and please subscribe to the channel to show your support. I wanted to share this story with you, as you have touched on a subject that I have some experience with. I have never seen a Dogman, but I have had several interactions with Bigfoots in the woods of Arkansas. As you are aware, I worked as a construction engineer for a major utility company in Arkansas. This particular job was in Hot Springs, Arkansas, which is an hour's drive southwest of Little Rock. The job was to build a power line from Hot Springs, Arkansas to Conway, Arkansas. Unlike the previous story, I did not have to scout the path of this transmission line, as we had several other power lines running through the area. This provided a significant amount of information, making my job easier. I was excited about this project because it was not far away from home, and Hot Springs, Arkansas is an awesome place to find ginseng. My encounter happened in August 2005. Excited to go ginseng, I completed my construction work in 2 days and had an entire day left over to waste. I was gathering ginseng roots a few miles outside Malvern, Arkansas. The spot was just off the road, which I liked because if anything went wrong I could quickly get back to my car. Estimating the distance, I was about 100 yards below the road down in the base of the hollow. While standing there cleaning the soil off some freshly picked ginseng roots, I started to get the feeling someone was watching me. Scanning the area, I saw no one, and went back to work. However, I could not shake that feeling of being watched. Looking up the slope, I saw what looked like a man in a long black fur coat, standing next to a tree. Unsure if my eyes were playing tricks on me, I looked around for a rock to throw in his direction. I figured some ginsenger had claimed this to be his territory and was trying to run me off. Turning and throwing the rock, I realized that the figure was 50 yards away uphill. I shouted, "Hey, get out of here!" The figure didn't move or make a sound. Starting up the hill to its location, I pulled myself up the steep slope using trees while maintaining my footing. I traveled about 25 yards when there was a huge sound. Looking up, an entire tree was falling in my direction. By diving to the left, I was able to dodge the tree, but what I heard next made my heart skip several beats. The scream of a male Bigfoot. The yell was massive, the sound was so guttural and deep. I froze for a few seconds and looked up the hollow, but nothing was there. Taking this as a sign to go, I hustled back up the other side of the hollow to my car. I didn't get a very close look at this Bigfoot. Truthfully, I was scared out my mind. When I got to the car, my hands were shaking, and I was an emotional wreck. This was only my first experience with Bigfoot, and it took me a while to comprehend what happened to me. I was scared to enter the woods after this, but was forced to as my job required extensive time in the woods. I didn't share my first encounter with anyone from work, only my wife and son.
I decided to share this story because I'm looking for answers and closure to something that happened in my teenage years. As a young lady in the early 1990s, I was a bit of a bad girl. My parents were not the most attentive as they were going through their divorce. I was a very attractive 16-year-old and fully into my sexuality at the time. My off-and-on boyfriend was 17 years old and played football for a local Catholic school. Usually on the weekend we would find a place to park and make out. This Saturday night we went to the movies and headed to the New Orleans lakefront seeking privacy. We decided on a place which was very dark with wide open space. Pulling in, my boyfriend parked his dad's truck facing the lake. We always took his dad's truck because it was elevated. It's important to understand that this truck was high. Standing on the ground next to the passenger door, I had to physically step up 3 feet to pull myself into his dad's truck. His dad used the truck for mud racing in the bayous during the summer. Anyway, back to the story. The location was several hundred feet away from some boat houses and a boat launch. Settling in, we talked for a while and hung out bit before things started getting hot and heavy. 30 minutes had passed when I thought I saw a black shadow out the corner of my eye. I wasn't sure, but it looked like a person. By this time there were several other cars parked off in the distance. Assumedly they were doing what we were. So I never gave any thought to it, and neither did my boyfriend. Turning my attention back to him, another 15 minutes passed by and were just finished making out when we both saw a figure moving towards the truck from the driver's side. The person was a good 35 yards away and moving quickly on all fours towards the truck. This is going to sound strange and stupid, but this person was moving like an animal. Similar to the way dog or cat would move. I could see the palms of the hands when his body jerked forward and the reflection of the sneakers from the moonlight. The person was moving forward, but their body was slightly angled. It looked crazy. As the person got closer I could see much better. He was wearing a grey t-shirt and grey sweatpants with white tennis shoes. To this day I don't understand why we didn't just pull off. I guess my boyfriend was afraid, or just in awe of what he was seeing. I really can't say how much time passed, but soon this guy was in front of our truck. We both slid down into the seats trying to hide. Peeking over the dashboard I could see. He was very tall and slim with long limbs, his head was bald, and he was white, but not normal for white people in Louisiana. He had eerie pale skin, it's hard to explain. He just stood there in front of the truck, not looking at us but staring into the darkness where the other cars were parked. Looking at this man was surreal. He was clearly a man, but something was evil and abnormal about him. Both windows in the truck were rolled up, so I didn't hear anything, but his chest movement was rapid like he was breathing heavy. My boyfriend was motionless, and his eyes were constantly moving back and forth. I opened my mouth to speak and he gestured to me to be quiet. The man was just standing there, and then what happened completely changed what I thought to be humanly possible. Taking 2 steps the man lunged forward, his right hand hitting the ground, then his left, followed by his feet pooping up in a backwards motion, and he was off and running again. The motion was so smooth and fluid, he was gone into the distance and within 20 seconds. My boyfriend slid back up in his seat and said, "What the fuck was that?" Frantically he cranked the truck, throwing it into reverse and began to back out of the area. The lights from the truck lit up the entire area as we backed away. In the distance we could see 4 figures standing there looking back at the truck. Their eyes reflected a reddish color in the headlight. We were out of the area in no time as my boyfriend ran every stop sign getting out of there. Stopping a few miles away, we talked and I really got freaked out. He told me there was more than one of these men near the truck. He saw a second man in his side mirror near the rear of the truck. He was taller than the one near the hood. Frightened and shaken, my boyfriend estimated that he was 7 feet tall, and was looking into the bed of the truck. We later learned that other high school students, who went to that area, had some frightening encounters with tall pale men who ran on all fours and had red eyes. What they were I don't know. Do you have any idea?
As a little boy I would often play alone. I was an awkward kid, much larger than the other children my age, and this often left me on the receiving end of taunts and bullying. As time passed my size proved to be my greatest asset and often helped me out in some sticky situations. It was my size that saved my life when I was 15 years old. My parents both were hard-working people, which forced me to spend plenty of time on my own. Our house was a 2-bedroom bungalow in a quiet neighborhood. There were plenty of kids around to hang out with, so evenings were spent playing outside. One evening right at dusk my friend Daryl and I ventured into a wooded area not far from our houses. This place was like a wonderland for 2 young boys. There were downed trees and many things to climb on. As the sun began to set we decided it was time to exit the area and head home. Daryl was a few steps ahead of me when I started to get the feeling we were being watched. Looking around there was nothing in eyesight, but I still felt unsettled. Just then there was a rustling in the bushes to my left and what looked like a person trying to hide next to a tree. Daryl, who was much more athletic than me, took off running. By the time I started running he was well ahead of me, shouting for me to run. The sound of footsteps could now be heard behind me as I ran. Up ahead of me was a downed tree. Daryl vaulted over it with ease. When I approached, my foot slipped and I tumbled forward, almost hitting my head on one of the branches. No sooner than I could catch my balance was someone grabbing me by the back of my pants. Looking back, what I saw still scares me to this day. It was a man we all knew and had given name Kane. Kane was a homeless drifter who was always in and out of jail. Some of the older kids in the neighborhood had a few run-ins with him that had left one of them in the hospital. He was rumored to be crazy and very dangerous. As he pulled me closer to him, I balled my fist and swung as hard as I could, landing a punch square to his cheek. This only infuriated him, and he said, "I was only going to scare you. Now I'm going to kill you." He looked serious, so I took the opportunity to run. After a few paces he tackled me and attempted to climb on top of me. After a few minutes of fighting him off me, he was clearly getting tired. His breathing was heavy and he leaned his body weight on top of me, trying to use it as leverage. All I could think of was to bite him. After sinking my teeth into his forearm, he let go and began to scream in pain. "You motherfucker!" he shouted, and stared at his arm like he could not believe I bite him. This was my opportunity to get away, so I slid away and sprinted out of the woods. When I reached my street, Daryl was running towards me with two older kids from the neighborhood armed with pipes and bats. They asked me what happened, and the two older boys went into the woods, instructing Dari and I to go home. The next day I asked what happened to Kane. The boys never gave a straightforward answer. They simply said no one had to worry about him anymore. A few months passed, then one evening there was a news story that a construction crew found the body of a homeless man beaten to death in the woods near my house. We all knew what happened to him. Police questioned kids in the area, but no one cooperated with the police investigation. Kane had terrorized the kids of the neighborhood and would not be missed. Do you want more stories? Please subscribe. Your support is appreciated.